She was the widow next door, graceful, distant, and quietly lonely. Then one night, everything changed, and I realized I might be the reason her heart woke up again. I first noticed her on a quiet Sunday morning. The kind of morning when the world feels paused, and even the air seems warmer than usual. I was watering the small patch of tulips in front of my apartment when I saw her across the street, kneeling in her garden, her hands buried in the rich, dark soil. She was impossibly graceful for her age, early 40s by my guess, with silver threads catching the sunlight in her chestnut hair. There was a rhythm to her movements, a quiet patience that made the world around her seem slower, softer. I don't know why, but I couldn't look away. Maybe it was the way she paused every now and then, lifting her face to the sky, letting the sunlight touch her skin. Or maybe it was the subtle loneliness in her eyes, something that didn't scream, "I'm sad," but whispered, "I've been waiting." She noticed me then. Not with alarm, but with a flicker of curiosity, like she had sensed someone observing her from afar but didn't feel threatened. She gave me a small, polite nod, just the tilt of her head, but it stayed with me. Something about that nod made me feel seen. Not in a superficial way, but in a way that made the corners of my chest ache with quiet longing. Days passed, and I found myself looking for her. Sometimes she was reading on her porch, a book resting lightly on her lap, the tips of her fingers brushing the pages with a delicate care. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from the vine climbing her railing, mixed with the earthy scent of the garden she tended so meticulously. I could see her lips move slightly, mouthing words to herself, lost in thought. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt a strange pull toward her, a combination of admiration, curiosity, and a silent wish to know her better. It wasn't just her beauty that captivated me, though she was undeniably beautiful in a way that felt timeless rather than fleeting. It was the way she carried herself, confidence tempered by a softness, as though life had taught her lessons she wore lightly, without bitterness. I wondered about the stories behind the faint lines near her eyes, the gentle set of her shoulders, the quiet weight in her gaze. I imagined the laughter and the grief she had carried, the late-night conversations she must have had with herself, the dreams she still harbored quietly, hidden from the world. And so, I started greeting her casually whenever our paths crossed. A nod here, a soft, "good morning," there, each word deliberate, careful, as though I were testing the waters of a friendship I didn't yet know I wanted. There was a subtle electricity in those small moments. A brush of hands when the mailbox forced us close, the faint warmth lingering longer than it should, a glance that held for just a heartbeat too long. I didn't know it then, but those first observations, those quiet mornings spent watching her from afar, were the first steps towards something I hadn't yet named, a connection that would slowly, gently, awaken both of us. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs lazily in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. I was carrying a box of old books down the narrow hall of our apartment building when I heard her voice, soft but clearly audible. "Oh, I'm so sorry I didn't see you there." I looked up and found her in the doorway across from mine, a grocery bag slung over her arm, her expression a mixture of surprise and something warmer, something that made my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't explain. She was holding a small carton of milk, teetering precariously, and I instinctively stepped closer, reaching out. "Let me help with that," I said. Our hands brushed as I took the bag from her, and the contact lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Her fingers were warm, her grip gentle yet steady, and I felt the subtle pulse of life in that brief connection. There was no rush, no awkwardness, just a quiet acknowledgement that for this moment, we were sharing a small, unspoken intimacy. "Thank you," she murmured, a hint of a smile touching her lips. Her eyes met mine, and for an instant, I caught a flicker of vulnerability, like she was used to carrying everything alone, and maybe, just maybe, she was letting someone else in, if only for a moment. We walked together toward the elevator, moving slowly, our steps in sync without trying. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread from her grocery bag, mingled with the subtle floral notes she always seemed to carry, and I found myself oddly aware of the warmth radiating from her presence. There was something grounding about it, a quiet steadiness that contrasted sharply with the restless energy I often felt in the world. The elevator ride was silent, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Our shoulders brushed lightly, and I could feel the soft tension in her posture, the way she subtly leaned toward the wall but didn't pull away from me. I wanted to say something clever, something that would make this accidental closeness seem deliberate, but all I could manage was a soft, "You live just across from me, right?" She laughed quietly, the sound low and soothing, like wind rustling through autumn leaves. "Yes," she said, and there was a warmth in her voice, a tiny invitation to continue this conversation, or at least this moment of shared space. As we stepped out of the elevator, I handed her the bag. Our fingers met again briefly, and this time, the touch lingered a fraction longer, enough for me to notice the way her palm fit almost perfectly in mine. "Thanks again," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something unspoken that made the air between us feel heavier, charged with quiet curiosity. When she turned to go into her apartment, I realized I hadn't wanted the moment to end. I hadn't even spoken about the small, ordinary thing that brought us together, the groceries, but the physical closeness, the warmth, the subtle electricity between us had said everything I couldn't put into words. And as I walked back to my own apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something small, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the world seem a little warmer, a little more alive. That accidental closeness had planted a seed, and neither of us fully understood yet how deeply it would grow. It started with a simple invitation, tea. She had knocked on my door one late afternoon, holding a small teapot, her cheeks slightly flushed from the walk. "I thought maybe you'd like some tea?" she asked, her voice soft, tentative, as if offering more than just a drink. I nodded, words caught somewhere between surprise and eagerness, and invited her in. Her apartment was warm, filled with the muted scent of lavender and old books, sunlight pooling through sheer curtains, casting patterns on the wooden floor. There was a quiet intimacy in the way she moved, arranging the teacups on my small coffee table, the faint clink of porcelain punctuating the silence. I noticed her hands, slender, expressive, with tiny scars that hinted at life lived fully, bravely, and sometimes painfully. We sat across from each other, the teacups steaming between us. I watched her lift the cup, feeling the warmth seep through the ceramic into her palms, and for a moment she seemed almost fragile, a little weightless. Then, quietly, she spoke. "I sometimes forget what it feels like to have someone just notice me," she said, her eyes tracing the rim of her cup. After my husband passed, it's been like walking through fog. You learn to exist, not to live." Her voice was steady, but I caught the tremor beneath it, subtle but undeniable. I felt a pull in my chest, the urge to reach across the table, to offer comfort, to be present in a way that words often fail to express. "I can't imagine," I said softly. "But I hear you. I see you." She gave a small, almost shy smile, and for a moment, the air between us seemed to vibrate with unspoken understanding. We sat like that for a while, letting the quiet stretch comfortably, broken only by the occasional sip of tea or the soft hum of the street outside. I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed slightly as we talked, the careful distance she had carried for years beginning to ease. There was a grace in her vulnerability, a courage that made my heart ache and swell all at once. I wanted to tell her that it was okay to feel, to admit longing, to lean on someone without shame. But I held back, sensing that this moment was hers to give, not mine to claim. As the sun dipped lower, casting the room in golden light, our conversation shifted to small, ordinary things, books we loved, music that lingered in memory, the scent of rain on concrete. Yet even in these mundane details, there was intimacy, a thread weaving itself between us. Every laugh, every shared glance, every pause filled with unspoken understanding deepened the connection. When she finally stood to leave, I felt the brief brush of her fingers against mine as she thanked me. The touch was fleeting, yet it carried the warmth of trust, the electricity of connection, and the subtle promise that this, whatever this was only beginning. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, heart still racing, mind replaying her words, the softness of her gaze, the quiet strength she carried so effortlessly. That afternoon, I realized that sometimes the deepest connections don't announce themselves with fireworks. They whisper, and you feel them in the spaces between words, in the small, intimate moments where two souls finally recognize each other. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I saw her at the bookstore. The kind of rain that makes the air smell like wet asphalt and old paper, and leaves the streets shimmering with reflections of neon signs and puddles. She was tucked into a corner of the shop, leaning against a tall bookshelf, a worn leather-bound novel open in her hands. Her hair was damp at the ends, clinging softly to the curve of her neck, and I couldn't help but notice how her presence seemed to bend the light around her, warm and steady against the gray blur of rain outside. I approached quietly, pretending to browse, but my eyes kept drifting toward her. She was flipping through pages with deliberate care, fingers brushing the paper so lightly it seemed like she was afraid of disturbing the story itself. Then our eyes met for a fraction of a second, just enough for a small, unspoken recognition to pass between us. I smiled slightly, she returned it, but her eyes held something more, something fleeting yet electric. I moved down the aisle, pretending to look at titles, but the tension between us was palpable. I watched as she shifted, the book lowering slightly as if she too sensed the pull in the space that separated us. Our hands almost touched when reaching for the same volume, and I felt that subtle jolt of awareness, the tiny friction of skin near skin that made the world pause. Neither of us withdrew immediately, prolonging the brush just enough to send a quiet thrill through my chest. She laughed softly when I made an innocuous comment about the book's title, and the sound seemed to echo through the quiet store. I noticed the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the gentle tilt of her head, the faint warmth radiating from her even through the casual distance we maintained. There was an unspoken tension in the way we moved around each other, deliberate yet hesitant, magnetic yet careful, as though testing the boundaries of something neither of us fully understood. The subtle closeness made me acutely aware of every detail, the soft rustle of her jacket, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the smell of old paper, the way her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulder, almost brushing my arm as she turned a page. Every glance, every shift of posture, felt loaded with meaning, small gestures carrying the weight of what we hadn't yet dared to say. When she finally tucked the book under her arm and walked toward the counter, our eyes met one last time. She paused just long enough to offer a look that said more than words ever could: curiosity, warmth, and a subtle longing. My chest tightened, and I realized that this, the tension, the fleeting touches, the unspoken connection, was slowly consuming me in the best possible way. As I stepped out into the rain, I couldn't shake the echo of that gaze. It lingered with me, a quiet, insistent pull that promised more, hinted at the possibility of something tender yet profound. That afternoon, I understood that romance doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes, it lives in the glances, the pauses, the almost touches that leave your heart unsettled and strangely full. It happened on a crisp Saturday evening. The kind of evening where the sun dips low, painting the city in shades of amber and rose, and the air carries the faint promise of something lingering, something unspoken. I had gone over to help her with a small home repair, nothing major, just a stubborn shelf that refused to stay level. But she insisted I come, her voice carrying that quiet mix of humor and subtle invitation I had come to recognize. As I adjusted the shelf, she reached over to hand me a tool, and in that motion, her fingers brushed against mine. There was nothing hurried or intentional, just the smallest contact, a fleeting warmth that lingered far longer than it should have. I felt the subtle pulse of her hand against mine, the soft tremor that came with it, and I realized my heart had skipped a beat, not out of fear, but anticipation. Then it happened. She stumbled slightly on the uneven rug, and without thinking, I caught her. My hands were on her waist, steadying her, and she pressed lightly against me, just enough to find balance. Her cheek hovered near my chest for a brief moment, her hair brushing against my shirt, and I could feel the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat through her thin sweater. It was intimate, but not in the way one expects intimacy to be. It was gentle, protective, a shared grounding in the small reality of the moment. We lingered like that for a heartbeat too long. I could feel her inhale softly, the warmth of her presence wrapping around me, and I realized that this, the first real physical closeness, was charged with a tenderness I hadn't anticipated. Her eyes met mine, slightly widened, and a faint, shy smile curved her lips. There was no rush, no expectation, just a silent acknowledgement of trust, of shared vulnerability. When I finally stepped back, she lingered near me, her hand brushing my arm as if reluctant to let go. That small gesture, so simple and unassuming, carried a weight far greater than words could express. It was the first time our proximity felt significant, electric, and entirely natural all at once. I noticed the subtle tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes softened when they met mine, and I knew we had crossed a threshold, not in romance, not yet, but in closeness, in the quiet courage to allow someone else to occupy our personal space. Afterwards, we sat on her sofa for a few minutes, the room filled with the soft hum of the city outside. We talked casually, but our shoulders brushed occasionally, and each accidental touch carried a lingering warmth, a subtle electricity that neither of us needed to name. I could feel her leaning slightly toward me, her hand resting close enough to almost meet mine again, and I realized that trust and intimacy often arrive in whispers rather than declarations. By the time I left, the air between us had shifted. That evening, the brush of hands, the steadying embrace, and the fleeting heartbeat against my chest had planted a quiet promise that this connection, fragile yet undeniable, was growing stronger with each shared moment. And for the first time, I understood that love, slow, tender, and profoundly human, didn't have to shout to be felt. It was late one evening when I found myself on her porch, a soft blanket draped across both our laps, the city lights stretching into the distance like scattered fireflies. The night air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of jasmine from her garden, and the quiet hum of crickets filled the space between us. Neither of us spoke at first. There was a comfort in the silence, a rhythm in the way our shoulders occasionally brushed, a subtle warmth where our legs touched under the shared blanket. She turned slightly to look at me, her eyes reflecting the soft, golden glow of the porch light. I feel alive again, she admitted quietly, almost as if saying it aloud made it fragile, vulnerable. I didn't realize how much I'd stopped hoping, stopped feeling, and then you started showing up. Her words hit me gently, like a wave brushing over my chest. I wanted to say something perfect, something that would make her fears, her doubts, vanish, but all I could manage was a soft, I didn't expect. I didn't know I could make you feel that way. My voice sounded small, almost shy, even to my own ears, but it was honest. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes completely. There was hesitation there, a vulnerability I had come to recognize in quiet, subtle ways. The pause before she spoke, the gentle tug of her hand on the blanket, the way she studied my face as if weighing every word. It's complicated, isn't it? She murmured. You're young, I'm not the same age as you. There are perceptions, expectations. People talk. I reached out instinctively, letting my hand hover near hers before finally brushing my fingers against hers. The contact was electric in its simplicity, her palm soft against mine, her skin warm under my touch. I could feel her hesitation, the careful weighing of consequences, yet she didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers rest against mine, a quiet surrender that spoke more than words ever could. I know, I said softly, but I also know how I feel when I'm with you. And it feels right. Even if it's not easy. My thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, feeling the subtle pulse of her life, the rhythm of her hesitation, and the quiet longing that mirrored my own. We sat there in silence for a while, letting the night stretch around us, the world outside distant and insignificant. Her gaze met mine occasionally, lingering longer each time, and I could see the conflict in her eyes, the tug between caution and desire, between the past she carried and the possibility of something new. Finally, she leaned slightly toward me, just enough for our shoulders to touch fully, her cheek near my chest, her hair brushing lightly against my shoulder. Maybe it's okay to feel this, she whispered. And in that moment, the tension that had been building between us for weeks, glances, touches, shared laughter, quiet moments of trust, found a fragile release. It wasn't a declaration, not yet. But it was more than anticipation, it was permission. Permission to feel, to hope, to imagine a closeness neither of us had dared to speak aloud until now. And as I held her hand gently in mine, I realized that the slow burn of our connection had finally reached a point where it could no longer be contained, where honesty and vulnerability created the bridge between hearts. The night had settled comfortably around us, thick with the quiet hum of the city and the occasional distant honk of a car. We were on her sofa, the blanket from the porch now draped loosely over our shoulders, the dim glow of a nearby lamp casting soft shadows across the room. The world outside felt impossibly far away, reduced to the gentle rhythm of our breathing and the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. We had been talking earlier, quietly, about small, ordinary things, books we'd loved in our youth, favorite songs that seemed to carry pieces of ourselves, and the kind of memories that make you both smile and ache at the same time. There was a comfort in these shared reflections, a bridge between our different worlds, and it felt as though each word, each pause, drew us closer without ever forcing the pace. At one point I noticed her head slowly leaning toward me, almost imperceptibly, until it rested gently against my shoulder. I stiffened for only a moment, surprised by the sudden closeness, before relaxing into it. Her hair brushed softly against my chest, and I could feel the subtle rise and fall of her breathing, each exhale a quiet confession of trust. I reached out, letting my hand settle lightly over hers, our fingers intertwining naturally. The warmth of her palm against mine, the gentle pressure of her thumb against the back of my hand, made my chest ache in a way I had never anticipated. She shifted slightly, and our legs brushed under the blanket, sending a quiet thrill through both of us. There was no rush, no need for words. The intimacy was found in the softness of our contact, the shared vulnerability of two people who had quietly waited for a connection like this. I could feel her heart steady against mine, a silent reassurance that we were both here, fully present, fully aware of each other. For a long while, we simply existed in that space, letting the night stretch on around us. Occasionally, her fingers would tighten gently around mine, or she would tilt her head to listen more closely to something I said, and each gesture carried weight far greater than its simplicity suggested. I realized that this, the quiet comfort of touch, the shared silences, the unspoken acknowledgement of desire, was what slow-burn romance was meant to feel like. Eventually, our conversation dwindled into soft murmurs and then into silence. I felt her shift once more, pressing her cheek lightly against my chest, her warmth seeping into me. I rested my chin atop her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. The world outside was still there, but it no longer mattered. Here, in this small, shared space, we had found a home in each other's presence. And as I watched her eyelids flutter closed, I realized that we had reached the perfect kind of resolution, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with gentle, enduring closeness. Her quiet sigh, the brush of her hand against mine, the subtle intertwining of our lives in that small room, it was the affirmation we both needed. We weren't just two people drawn together. We were two souls who had patiently waited, and now, finally, we could simply be together. The night deepened, and I felt a calm certainty wash over me. Love, I understood then, didn't always demand fireworks. Sometimes, it arrived softly, gently, and lingered, like a heartbeat against your own, steady, warm, and utterly unshakable.